Hey, this is Pastor Tim Delaney coming to you once more as we prepare for our walk through our Bible and with what we've been working with on this. And today we actually wrap up our time in the Pentateuch. Remember, the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible, and that's what we're going to be working on today, is that last book, which we know as Deuteronomy. And the big thing about Deuteronomy is that we take on a big task that goes on here. You're going to see some of the slide stuff are going to be a bit different than what we have in the past 4, just because Deuteronomy handles things a little bit differently and goes about this differently. So what we're going to do is we're going to then jump right into this. So of course our first thing is of course looking at our authorship. That's one of the big things that we've been doing each and every single time, and of course, as you know, is with this being the Mosaic laws, the first 5 books of Moses. So we're looking at this being, of course, the traditionally set with Moses. Compared to some of the other books, with the exception of Numbers, Deuteronomy actually does play a little bit of a bigger factor into drawing that attention onto Moses, especially when you consider the fact that the text itself, like Deuteronomy 1:1, Deuteronomy chapter 31:9, and the bulk of chapter 24 there draws that attention to the fact that it is Moses who is the author of this whole book, of all these books. One of the things that's very interestingly enough to do too, is it is widely understood that the last chapter, however, chapter 34, the final chapter, as you can see on my list here, where it says the final chapter, chapter 34, however, was not, because this records the death and burial of Moses himself. So there's of course the attribution that this was either towards Joshua, who would play a major factor as his second command, who would take over his leadership, or with the prophet Ezra, in which we will see both of these two with their own little books set up later. But right now, that's not our main focus right now. Right now, our main focus, of course, is this. And then, of course, with our modern scholarship, this kind of plays into, in fact, the same attribution of this being, that final chapter being attributed to Joshua and later writers as well, does also play into the fact of the modern scholarship, knowing full well that with Moses' age, depending on when he would have recorded or wrote these down, he would have had aid, he would have had assistance, and we have to remember one very important thing, and this kind of plays a little bit into the content or the context of this, that remember, this was a people who were traveling a lot. So they're nomadic in this case, and so that meant that there was a lot of mouth to ear. This was an oracle, or not oracle, but an oratory tradition. They spoke, they told these in stories. I mean, think of the whole idea of the campfire setup. And so this was something that they were commanded and had to do throughout this different time. And so one of the also things is that is very big about Deuteronomy 2 is that this is also a book of repetition. Remember, back in Exodus, we had our recounting of the 10 Commandments. Well, we had that whole interaction. Deuteronomy does a recount, or a repetition, or a repeat of this, because remember, we have moved from the old generation to the new generation. And so there needs to be a reaffirmation of what this looks like. And so with that in mind, as we look at that, we then of course look at our different genres that come from this book. With the fact that this is a reaffirmation of the covenant, this is a reassessment of what this all looks like. Of course, this is going to be a big focus on what's called a covenant document, or what we see as a treaty in this case. It's an ancient treaty that rehashes what the structural outline of what this looks like between God and the people. And so with that in mind, also entails the laws, and so there's a rehash on the legal codes. It's a historical narrative in this case that we see a little bit more of that historical build-up for the people of Israel. And then we call what is called a hortatory sermons, or exhortation, or speeches, as we could also say too. I mean, and this is packed full because remember, we've moved from the old generation to the new generation. And so we see this massive change from the new generation and how this stuff is handled and done. And so when we look at some of our key aspects of what this looks like, we see, of course, that whole once more that ancient treaty. So this, of course, entails and plays out more of what the treaty looks like between God and the people. Not only is this sermon, or is this a set of sermons that we see with Moses near the end, but this is also the whole farewell address. Moses is also, remember, Moses is part of that old generation. He will not be allowed to go into the new promised land. Well, I shouldn't say new, but back into the promised land. He was only allowed to glimpse it, which is one of the big things that entails by the end of this book. And of course, the whole legal code, the word Deuteronomy itself implies a repetition of law, or a second law. And this is, of course, once more the reestablishment of our Ten Commandments. We'll talk that a little bit more about that, especially once it gets closer to, we kind of do our outline of things with chapters 12 through 26 on this. And then remember, once again, as I said, it's a historical narrative, and so this reviews the history of the Exodus to the wilderness, to the context of the laws that we see as they pass into the promised land. And so it's best understood this is a preached law, or a blend of theology, law, and history that's aimed at the faithfulness of the covenant. And so what we see even further, though, is now we look at our main themes and a bigger, large set of what the purposes are in this. We, of course, see the main purpose of Deuteronomy is, of course, the focus on that second law that we talked about. The renewal of the covenant with the people, the new generations, the Israelites that would be leading the nation into the promised land versus the older generation that had struggles and problems with that. And so we're going to see that change that comes with this. And so we see this urging of them to love, fear, and obey God in secure blessings and avoid exile. I'm going to adjust the camera for a moment real quick. There we go. That's a little bit better on that. There we go. And so what we're seeing in all that stuff, we see that then break down into a number of different themes through here. First off, of course, we see with the whole concept of renewal. That's been an ongoing theme, what I've been saying quite a bit when it comes to this whole setup. And so, of course, what this looks like is the book acts as an official ratification. Remember, they were given the law at Mount Sinai, then they went through the desert, they went through wilderness, they had these problems, and now as they prepared to go into the promised land, they are now going to be expected to uphold and to follow this more fully. Then, of course, we have the heartfelt love and fear of God. I found this fascinating when I found this among a couple different resources. Everything from the New Interpreter's Bible for a suggestion on this, to the Blue Letter Bible, to also some of the IPP and others resources too. And so there is what this focuses around, the central demand is not a legalistic compliance, but a heartfelt choice to follow in with God. And so that, of course, plays into that whole choice between life and death. It's a major theme about choosing to do the right thing. That is a choice for us to go forward with God, for the people to. And then, of course, this leads right into the whole remembering of God's faith. Moses urges the people to remember their history, specifically about how God had rescued them from slavery, how God had heeded their words. Granted, it took a little while, but as we all know, God doesn't work by our time. And so, of course, that plays out even more so in the fact that we have Moses reminding them of how they came from slavery, how they were encouraged faith, and to avoid idolatry and all that they do into this. And of course, then focuses a singular place for worship, that God would choose what this would look like. And then, of course, this breaks apart and breaks away from the whole concept of idolatry, because unfortunately that's one of the big things that we see that plays out throughout Canaan, is that we see idolatry has taken on such a drastic root with things. So then, of course, we fall into that last one, the social and ethical responsibility of things. The law codes emphasize justice, generosity, and care for the vulnerable, including the least, the less, the needy, poor, orphans, widows, and foreigners. I mean, this is the ethical aspect of what it truly means to be a decent human being. I mean, it's a book of morals and ethics. And more than anything, that's what God is asking of the people. God is calling of you. I mean, we can even break it down. That's what God's demanding of the people, to be a decent human being. And that means to, of course, love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. And so as we kind of look into the more context of what's going on, is that, remember, this is the final book of the Torah. This is the first of three sections of the Tanakh, the text of the people. And of course, this entails everything from, as I was saying, the moral code of things, to Moses saying a farewell, letting the people know of what's going on. So what the context of this book is plays a major factor of what was to what will be, especially when you look at the historical moment of this. This is coming out of the 40 years of wilderness wandering. The first generation, with the exception of Moses, has died, and so now we look at the next generation who will then carry this all forward. And so the location of this then plays greatly into the land of Moab, down to that southern part, in which is east of the Jordan, opposite Jericho. So I mean, this is a small area that's coming up through. I should put a map up on here to show you, but it's really fascinating to see on that part. So then, of course, what the purpose of this whole context of the book does is interlate to encourage and to remind the people. That's why we kind of see it as the giving or reminder of the second law, reminder of what is to happen. And so, of course, what that plays out with some of the key points is the fact of covenant renewal, obedience versus disobedience, love for God, and of course that whole central aspect of what worship will be for the people. And of course then plays out into the summary that the main focus, like you see, we're not looking at the theme part or the points or the structure, we're looking at the summary. What is the main focus of this is that the book of Deuteronomy, the final book of the Torah, features Moses' farewell speech to a new generation of Israelites before they enter the promised land. And so what that means is that, of course, we'll see a rehash of the Ten Commandments and an urge to following God, and ultimately what Moses will put on as a challenging them to choose life over death, to choose God over all else that goes on. So with all that in mind, now we kind of look at the whole larger focus of what the major sections are. Because ultimately what I found, the most common belief is the book of Deuteronomy broken down into 4 sections. Some of the ways I've discovered, like IVP, kind of are rearranges some of the scripture, like what includes in each part, but this is one I found to be the most commonly practiced, or at least the most common way of looking at this. And so the book of Deuteronomy is broken down, that we're going to look into 4 sections. That first section, which I have listed off as the first address or the historical aspect of this, and this goes from chapter 1 up to chapter 4, verse 43. It kind of splits the chapter a little bit there, but what this does is that Moses reviews the journey of Sinai. I mean, like, this is the first part. He pretty much gives a telling and reviews what has happened from Mount Sinai up to this point now, in which they look at the rebellion, God's faithfulness. So we're looking at everything from a preface to what's going on here, to faith affirmed, tested, and judged. The first campaigns with peace in our military, because remember, they ran into the Moabites during this time, and they had lots of troubles here with them. You had the great summons to obedience. This was a warning against complacency and idolatry. Remember, complacency is just being fine with what happens. So if someone challenges me, just go with it. So it's a reminder of not to be complacent. Don't become lax in the way things are. Sometimes, faith is an organic thing that grows and flourishes, and that's how we are supposed to be too in our faith. That second address, which then focuses on law and covenant, the obligations of what is expected of the people. And this is like the biggest of the 2 sections, because this goes from, remember where I said that first section cuts off at chapter 4, verse 43. This picks up in chapter 4, verse 44, and goes all the way up to chapter 26, verse 19. We're looking at the core section. This is where we see that rehash of the 10 Commandments, as I'm sure you assumed. And so this is the reestablishment of specific laws for worship, justice, and social life in the Promised Land. So, of course, Moses takes that time to reintroduce what covenant law looks like with that latter part of chapter 4 and first part of chapter 5 that entails what is expected of the people. God chosen to be their God as God has chosen to be his people. That's how that plays out. Then, of course, we look at the major focus of the covenant rule, the Ten Commandments, in which one of the things I like to draw attention to is that God was very intentional on these laws, in which if you look at the first four, they focus on God and the people. So you're looking at love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. You're keeping that all in that case. Then, of course, you have the latter six, which then becomes among the people. Oh, look, haha. But you get that major focus among the people themselves. So, of course, do not bear false witness, jealousy, lying, cheating. I mean, you don't do those kind of stuff. And then we fall into a little bit of a larger section that is focused on the Mosaic exhortations. And what this pretty much means is that this is what Moses is pretty much preaching on this stuff. He's now taking the time to preach, to teach the people how important this is, how this should be done, what this looks like. Then we look at laws dealing with unity and purity of worship, so the fact that they need to be united in this together. Regulations concerning the sacred divisions of time, public authority, leadership, matter of death and life. And of course, what this focused on, this was chapter 19, verses 21, in which this actually entailed and focuses around murder, warfare, capital offense, inheritance. I mean, what we're seeing here plays a major factor in, once again, morality and ethics of things. Maintaining the divine order of life, meaning that focus of, and when it says divine order of life, like how we should be living, how the people should be living their life with God, in God, and through God. Matter of general contact, liturgy of thankfulness, and then of course we have that third address, which this falls into blessings, curses, in that final exhortation. Like this is the final words, the final things that Moses speaks about in this case, in which we actually see Moses presents the consequences of obedience versus disobedience and urges the people to choose life. So we see the life of both blessing and curses, behavior not permitted in Israel, God's order of like what God is going to maintain us, and then of course the great farewell. This was not a very big, but I mean it does span 2 chapters in this case. Well, I mean I guess you could say that's a long one, but Moses gives that final farewell of how he is passing on the reins. And so then on that last section, which is chapters 31 through 34, we see that leadership transition. We see the death of Moses, what is also what I have listed off as the appendices, the leadership transition. Joshua is commissioned as the new leader. The Song of Moses is delivered, and Moses dies after viewing the land. And so, of course, what we're seeing here is that we see that preparation. Moses is preparing and bringing all this stuff together in life. And then, of course, we have the Song of Moses. This is one of the most beautiful, amazing parts that we see in this, in which Moses, like, calls for the people each year to take time to sing this song. And the Song of Moses pretty much tells the history of the people. It is one massive song. It is three chapters that focuses on the history of the people and what has brought them to this point right then and there, to help remember the past. Remember, it's that whole that by forgetting, when we refuse to learn the history, we are doomed to repeat history. And we see that majorly play out into this, where Moses is to prevent what could happen again, what you had all done before. Learn this, take this to heart, learn from it, go forward from there. One of the things that does frustrate me a little bit that they don't include in these general outlines that I found for this is the fact that they completely blow over the song and dance and worship that Miriam leads them through. I mean, Miriam has this wonderful little moment there as essentially the main worship leader of the Israelite people, where she leads them through a song and a dance, and like this is what she does before she passes herself. It's beautiful, amazing. I highly recommend checking that out. But that falls in those areas, because then this leads into the blessing of Moses. We have the death of Moses, and of course that is our major sections that kind of leads us through the whole set. But that's only if we look at it from the perspective of the major sections. That's just we're very legalistic as we look at it from this part, because as we all know, as I've said countless times, these are narratives. These are considered historical narratives, like tell a story. So they're not all cut and dry like our how to do things for dummies or anything like our instruction manuals that says this, and this. This is a narrative that tells a story. It's not an instruction manual. It's a telling a story to be how the people are. So, of course, when we look at that from a narrative flow or a narrative perspective, we see this change quite a bit in the way things are done. Because now it still, of course, maintains the context of what the movements from here forward are going to be, but the context section does focus on that rehashing of the 40 years. We see that very focused setup, and then we have movement 1. I should have put like the little secondary stuff underneath each of these, but movement 1 then speaks about the law code, or no, historical review. And this is where he recounts the past, focusing on God's faithfulness and Israel's past disobedience. Like, remember those spies, the golden calf, to kind of motivate that whole relationship and loyalty as they go into the promised land. Like, this is that big moment where Moses is trying, okay, I need you to learn to not make the same mistakes again. And so that's what we're seeing in that movement 1 of things. Movement 2 then, of course, focuses on the rehashing of the 10 Commandments. I mean, one way I put the note into this is to imagine that this law code section, movement 2, is pretty much like if you were going to a worship service. You have, of course, someone reading the scripture. In this case, it's the 10 Commandments. And then you have the minister or whoever it is that gives the message to give the message. Just in this case, I mean, we'd be looking at a couple hours instead of, I try to stay between 12 to 20 minutes for my sermons, just because I want to get the point across as clear as possible. But, I mean, this is different. Different context, different place, different time. We're looking at this very differently. But yeah, we see this whole outline of specific laws, codes, regulations. It's that whole idea of what it means to be. It's the ethical part, the moral part of this story. And then, of course, movement 3, which is the covenant consequences and transition. And this pretty much is where we see the biggest switch from the sectional setup, because this one focuses on the whole transition. Once again, it's that transition, but instead of including Moses' blessing with the sermons, this one begins with Moses giving a blessing upon the people, think like the benediction setup, and then handing it over to the next person. And then, of course, once that leadership is delivered onto Joshua and he's christened to do this, Moses gives one final little blessing. He goes upon the mountain's top, he looks at the promised land, and then he dies. Probably not so I made that sound very cartoony as he said that, but not as cartoony as that was. But see, the thing is, not only do we have this from a legalistic aspect of looking at this from, or I guess you could even say a scholarly setup with our major sections to our storytelling, but of course, with this being is that we always have the way of being able to look at this from themes, because there are, of course, several major themes that play into this. Because one of the key themes, of course, that plays throughout this whole setup is the monotheism, that God's uniqueness, the divine election, the goodness of the land, the necessity of central worship, central of heart obedience, and just, I mean, it follows a somewhat legalistic way of laying things out. So, of course, the biggest theme, of course, of this, I have to say the first one here is the major theme, like the major top focus of what this theme of this book is of course covenant renewal. I mean, it is essentially a series of sermons by Moses stemming from Mount Sinai up to this point and rehashing what the expectations are for the new generation to come. This, of course, plays out with one of the themes of theology, love, and obedience, the central focus of their relationship, their covenant with God, is love and obedience. Now, obedience is not just specifically on the people, but the obedience of the people is reflective on the obedience that God has onto them. And so you see this majorly play on that part. And of course, the whole monotheism and idolatry, is very, very heavily influenced the fact that God is a jealous God. That our God only wants to be the only one at the center of our worship and focus like this. That there are, and what's fascinating is the fact of the acknowledgement that there are other gods, in which that will actually play kind of a factor much later in the things as we get going, but right now this is one of those things that Moses really definitely hashes and lays out because of the importance of what that looks like in being one with God in that case. So of course, the one that we've kind of been seeing a lot is that centralization of worship, and this focuses on the that worship only at a single central place that God chooses, that when they actually get into the promised land, that it will come to them that God has picked that one location that they'll all be coming together to. Eventually that will be Jerusalem. We know that for a fact. And it's kind of a foreshadow to what David and Solomon wish for in the creating of a temple for God. The promised land and God's faithfulness, another one of those ones that's major in the fact that the book highlights God's faithfulness in keeping his promise. God promised the ancestors that they would be gone, but they would come back. And so what we see is that in spite of all of the wrong that the people did, all of the times that they grumbled against God, complained against God, turned against God, that God remained faithful. Then this one also highlights a great deal of what social justice looks like. We can't say that this is just a modern saying or anything, because honestly, Jesus was social justice because of what was taught in the scriptures that he preached from, what he gained. And that, of course, emphasizes a great deal in what we find with Deuteronomy. It emphasizes the care for the poor, the vulnerable, widows, orphans, etc., foreigners. This has specific comments and laws about how to care for foreigners, aliens, people, because there's a constant reminder that Moses, don't forget, you were once foreigners in a land, and they took care of you. Granted, they eventually got enslaved, but beside the point. But they were welcome there. Remember, with the time of Joseph saved the people, so the Pharaoh welcomed them wholeheartedly. They were given the most fertile and amazing land in all of Egypt on the north part along the Nile. They had the most fertile land possible. So this is a reminder of what this all looks like. And so what we see here is that then that final theme is that blessing in Christians, it's laid clear out that obedience leads to life and blessings, while disobedience leads to curses and ultimately exile. It's a very good possibility that we're seeing a foreshadow here of what that would look like in the days to come. Now, what we're seeing is some of our major figures, because this is not just a cut and dry, but of course our major figures here is we do have, of course, the new Israelites, the new generation, but that's not where our focus is. Our primary figures, of course, falls upon Moses, who leads this entire book, that leads this entire setup of what's going on here. He's the mediator of the covenant, recounts the history, he's the teacher, he reviews the laws, and pleads with the people to remain faithful to God. And we're told that he is 120 years old by this point. Of course, our other major figures includes Yahweh, God, the whole center of the worship and the focus of the relationship that the people have in their faith, and Joshua, who was designated by God and commissioned by Moses to be the next leader. Joshua is tasked with leading the Israelites into the promised land. He represents the future, faithfulness, and courage. And so, of course, we see a number of groups of people. We see the Israelites. This is the new generation. This is the people who are listening to these words of Moses and Joshua and preparing to go into the promised land that was promised to their parents, to their grandparents, but they had turned away from God on this. We have the Levites. The Levites are your priestly order, stem from the tribe of Levi. They were originally led by Aaron, brother of Moses in this case. And so they play this key role in the central role of worship and legal structure of what's going on. They're very focused around religious leadership and their structure of things. And then, of course, we have the elders and judges. These are the local leaders. These are the people that were appointed among each of the 12 tribes that would represent the tribes. Think a little bit like we do with senators today in our democracy, where we vote or we designate a couple people to represent us on the larger scale of things. That's kind of what this is playing towards a little bit. And then, of course, we have the patriarchs, which is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're frequently invoked to represent God's original promise. They look back to them quite often in these cases. We do, of course, what good story doesn't have a few villains in there? And in this case, we do have Sihon and Og, who are the kings of the Amorites, and Bashan, respectively known, whom the Israelites defeated. These were some of the first major victories that the people of Israel had as they entered into as they sought to the promised land. We saw in the last bit the whole Moabites in our last book, but this time we're looking at a more focus of the people more into Canaan. And of course that's where we see the Canaanite gods, but in this case we're looking more at the idols. While not active agents, the false gods of Canaan worshipped in stone images, wooden images. We see they're constantly warning against that the people do not fall in line with these people on this. And then, of course, some of the significant mentions is Aaron mentioned in the context of his death, the transfer of priestly duties to his son Eleazar, and the incident of the golden calf. And then we have this prophecy that Moses speaks of some future prophet. I'm going to read this as I have this down. Moses prophesies that God will raise up a prophet like him from among the Israelites, whom the people must listen to. There is lots of speculation of who this might be. I firmly like to believe that this was a very vague setup, because if we look throughout the Old Testament, we have many prophets who would actually play major roles in the life of the Israelite people. More commonly, this is addressed towards as Jesus, because it says, whom the people must listen. Moses prophesied that God will raise up a prophet like him. And so oftentimes, because of what Moses accomplished and did that changed the people, it's oftentimes directed towards Jesus in this part. But honestly, I would say that this is more vaguely mentioned because Elijah, Samuel, Nahum, we see Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. We see a variety of different prophets who play major factor roles in the livelihood of the people. So that I can leave to you. If you actually have any insight or what you think on them, feel free to place that in the comments, whether on Facebook or on YouTube once these are uploaded on there. So you're more than welcome to do that if you feel led to do so. So next what we're looking at is we're going to look at some of the key teachings, because remember, Deuteronomy is the second law. It's about the renewal of bringing out that. So what this looks like is, of course, what we play out in this. And some of these you'll notice are very similar to other ones, because these are just key teachings that play larger parts. The covenant renewal, we'll get through these ones pretty quickly, because most of them are just repeats of before. The covenant renewal, calling a new generation to reaffirm their faith in God. Love and obedience, the central command of God's love is to love and to be obedient. That God's love for us was unconditional in spite of what had happened. We see the central of worship, God being the focus of our worship, remembering God's acts, the call to remember the past and the history of what led them to where they are, to even where we are to this day. Election and grace, Israel stands as God's chosen people based on God's love and promise to their ancestors, not by their own merit or strength. We continue that with, of course, blessing and cursing. The consequences of keeping or breaking the covenant are laid out very socially. that ethical part of the people's expectation to care for those who I oftentimes like to refer to as the least, the less, and the needy, and then of course the land as a gift, that this was a precious gift promised and given to them by God from their ancestors. So of course, what does that mean? What does that bring to our conclusion of things? The ultimate meaning of the book of Deuteronomy is to serve as a passionate final call to remind the people of what it looks like to follow God, to be in the footsteps of God. And so what this pretty much looks like is these little, I won't call them rules, but little guidelines. Total devotion, a covenant structure, having a memory-driven faith, social moral justice, human responsibility, hope amidst failure. I mean, this is a book of remembrance. I mean, at the very core and at the start of everything here, this is a book of remembrance. Remember what it is so you don't repeat the past. So, but of course, how does that play out for us today? Well, interestingly enough, as I kept going through this stuff, I kept thinking, like, this is a guide to live life, love, obedience, and faithfulness. So what does that look like for us? And I'm reminded of this quote by Tom Hanks, who says, "There's no substitute for a great love," who says, "No matter what's wrong with you, you're welcome at this table." I mean, Tom Hanks wasn't referring to faith necessarily in this case, but just good hospitality, what it meant to be a decent human being. But I mean, that plays out so much in what we understand our faith to be. That God loves us so much that, I mean, let's look at what I do when we do our during worship, when I talk about our tithing, especially when I talk about communion, that Jesus knew that his disciples were faulty. He knew that they would betray him. He knew that they would turn away from him, they would deny him, that they would do all this stuff, and yet he welcomed them all to the table. I mean, Judas still partook of that last meal before leaving. I mean, Jesus demonstrates a love that is something we cannot fully understand, which is why what that means for us today is, of course, looks at the greatest commandment, loving the God with all our heart, mind, and soul, and of course the second like that, to love your neighbor as yourself. Living in a covenant relationship and it's not just a covenant relationship with God, but how our relationship with God should reflect our relationship with other people. Ethical living and justice, in which this provides specific instructions for how we train. Like, we could really learn from the book of Deuteronomy about what it means to be a decent human being. Combating apathy. I mean, it warns against forgetting God and urges believers to remember. I mean, this is a major focus of what we are. It's a wisdom literature, so the laws are often interpreted as timeless wisdom for godly living rather than a legal code. I mean, we can look at this as a legalistic transaction. We can look at this as a how-to or an instruction manual, but then it's going to be hollow. I mean, the whole focus of this whole thing is that our faith, our love, is an organic way. It grows, it flourishes. You can't just check off like you do on a checklist. That's the big thing of what Moses is trying to get through. That's the big thing of what faith with Deuteronomy can teach us and show us in our life to come. So, I hope you've enjoyed this whole take with the Pentateuch, what we see with the 5 books, the Torah that we see here, because next week, in 2 weeks, we're going to then be jumping right into the book of Joshua, in which we see what happens after this. How do things go? And I'm going to tell you right now that things don't go perfectly. Spoiler. But I hope you've been enjoying this time together. I hope you really appreciate what we're doing with this. Please go ahead and drop a like onto these. Share with your friends. If you have any questions, challenges, or thoughts on what goes on here, feel free to mention those in the or down in our messages, down in our conversation spots, because it'd be always exciting to see what people have to say, what they do, or if you don't feel comfortable with that, you can always send us a message too. So I hope you have yourself a good day, a good week. Weather is hopefully going to be getting better soon, so you have yourself a good day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.